Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Aware Athlete Show. All right, everyone, welcome to the podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Crawley, and his book is Out of Thin Air, Running Wisdom and Magic from Above the Clouds in Ethiopia. So, Michael, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, very nice to have you on the show today. I think this is going to be fascinating and very beneficial for the runners or other people who may be listening to this. So, a little background, a brief sentence or two. What's anthropology? And then after that, maybe what happened in your life that got you started in the direction of being an anthropologist?
Sure. So social anthropology, what I do is kind of defined as in terms of a research method by something called ethnography, which basically means spending a long period of time in a place and with a group of people and trying to understand basically what the world looks like from their point of view. So in my case, that meant spending 15 months with runners in Ethiopia and trying to understand what the world looks like from the point of view of a young man, basically, who is trying to change his life through the sport of running. So that would be basically what I was trying to describe. How did I get into that? I think I've always been interested in kind of running cultures in a broader sense. So what is it that makes a group of people willing to run 100 miles a week, or what makes that seem like a normal thing to spend your time doing? And I was interested in that in the northeast of England with Gateshead Harriers, which was a running club that in the 1980s had runners running at world-class level, but working full-time jobs and just sort of fitting their running in around their jobs. So I was interested in what it was that made that work. And then I realized that perhaps I could do a project where I got to go to Ethiopia and spend a couple of years over there and things. So that's why I wrote the proposal to do the book.
Okay, so actually, in a very general way, spending time with people and trying to understand their culture or their point of view is, I think, something. Wow, if more of us did that in a general way, we don't have to be an anthropologist, but just listening and understanding, that would make the world a lot better place.
Yeah, totally. It's been described as just deep hanging out.
Yeah,
In the simplest
yeah.
sense. Having the time to give to people basically and listen to what they've got to say. So that's why the book, I try to allow the runners to kind of tell their own stories as much as possible, try to quote them, try to explain what it looks like from their point of view, basically.
Yeah, and I've written a book. It was a lengthy process, and I'm assuming that you worked with an editor.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, editor at Bloomsbury. It was relatively light touch, the editing. We kind of moved the chapters around a little bit towards the end to make it flow better. And one of the things that I kind of changed from the PhD thesis, because I wrote a PhD thesis before the book on the same material. But one of the things I did a bit differently with the book that's aimed at a more popular audience was that I wrote myself into it a lot more. So it's got a bit more of my kind of personal narrative as well.
Okay.
And that's something that they encouraged me to try and bring out a little bit. I was a bit reluctant to be in the book too much myself, but we ended up writing me into it a little bit more.
Well, okay, so that brings up a couple things. One is with deep hanging out, you actually are an elite athlete yourself, and that enabled you to actually get you talk about participation and observations that allow you to do the participation part a lot more deeply. So what got you into running, and what got you up to a level to where you could actually participate with some of the best runners in the world there in Ethiopia?
I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying before about the sort of culture of running in the northeast of England. I was brought up in Durham. I happened to live a few doors away from a guy who'd run a 2:14 marathon back in the early 80s. And I got into running, went down to the running club and things, but it was him. He kind of he realized that I was relatively talented. And through talking to him and hearing his stories about people like Charlie Spedding, who won an Olympic bronze medal in the 1980s, and people like that who were doing their training in the same places that I was running, but also performing on the world stage. His stories and the books that he lent me about running and things just got me kind of hooked into with the kind of romanticized version of what distance running is, I guess. And I was kind of hooked. And that's why I ended up getting to the level I got to. I think it wouldn't have happened without his kind of mentorship. But then what was interesting was that I was running, in Scotland, where I was living before I went to Ethiopia. I was finishing sort of in the top 10 of national championships, sometimes as high as second in national championships. And then I went to Ethiopia, and it was, I realized just how relative the sport is, because I was suddenly going from being able to finish second in a national championships to being so far behind everyone. So it was an interesting sort of shift in perspective from that point of view.
Yeah, and you were you were young enough to do this project too. You were running with a lot of relatively young runners there in Ethiopia, right?
Yeah. So some of the guys in the group that I was working with were as young as about 18, 19, ranging up to sort of maybe 30 with marathon runners.
Yeah. So that is another interesting thing there, because you talk about going to Ethiopia, but running is a culture in itself, and it inspired you. It brought you along into its culture. And I've found that actually you can get to know people better when you're running with them sometimes than when you meet them in a coffee shop.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a pretty cool thing to do, to hang out with runners.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's a really great video. I think it's just called The Runners. It's a film that was made by Ivo Gormley. And for it, basically what he did was he had a camera strapped to the back of a trailer, and he rode his bike, or somebody rode a bike in front of people who were running in Regent's Park in London. And he would ask people in the middle of a run really intimate questions like, are you in love? And stuff like that. And because people were running, and because their inhibitions were kind of broken down a little bit, people just gave him these really just straight up answers to questions that you would never answer to a stranger in any other circumstance. So I think it does, it has this amazing ability to kind of increase bonds between people and make that kind of social contact possible.
Yeah. So outer background, let's see. Can you comment? Well, first of all, I think people need to really appreciate. I think a lot of us runners have read books on, there's a book, Running with the Canyons, and there's several, books where you can kind of get into that culture a little bit. And you've heard of the famous coaches there in Kenya and so on. But you point out in the book that a lot of Kenyans speak English. So that makes that a lot more accessible. So what you've done is given us a real unusual look at some more African runners, the Ethiopians, and we haven't gotten too many books on that. And I found yours really fascinating, because there's some little bit different things in there, and particularly, first of all, can you comment on the nature of the structure that athletes get into there, the coaching and assistant coaching and agent and sub-agent culture? How does that all work for them? Say a young man in Ethiopia wants to run. What kind of a system does he get into?
Okay, so it's quite a complicated system, really. But there's a huge, what I think a lot of people don't realize is there's a huge amount of institutional support for runners in Ethiopia. So since Abibi Bikila won the Olympic marathon in 1960, it was seen as a way of kind of demonstrating Ethiopian talent on a world stage, I suppose. So the government has quite strongly supported running. And that means that there are lots of running clubs that are funded by, the local bank or the water corporation or the cement factory, and they will support maybe 30 to 50 runners to live and train full time. So you've got hundreds of athletes who are basically full-time athletes. And then you have government supported training camps that are in rural areas for young people as well. So you've got this amazing system where there's just a a critical mass of people able to dedicate the time to running twice a day and doing very little else. So that basically really helps. And then you have between those clubs a real kind of fierce rivalry on the domestic scene. So you have half marathon races or cross country races in Ethiopia. They're just such competitive, amazing races to watch. So I got to go and, to run in some of those races and also watch them. So just to kind of prove that you're good enough to warrant getting out of Ethiopia to go to a race is already an incredibly difficult and competitive project, basically, for anyone. And then how it works sort of beyond that is network of primarily American and European managers who arrange races for people and arrange their visas to go to races, and then take basically a flat rate of 15% of all of their earnings for the service of arranging that stuff to go abroad. So you kind of got this domestic system and then an international system that sometimes are in conflict with each other a little bit, but usually work relatively well.
Yeah. So it's actually harder to win some of those domestic races than it is on the international scene then, because you're racing against all that Ethiopian talent.
Yeah, totally. That's what they would say. They'd say, when we race here in Ethiopia, you've got to beat 100 Ethiopians. If you race in Boston Marathon, there's normally 6, 7. So it's fiercely competitive in those races.
Now, what you described there is similar to what it would be like to get into a system in Kenya, isn't it? Or what are the contrasts there?
I think there's probably slightly fewer athletes supported sort of directly by, sort of financially by government organizations in Kenya. So I think that kind of institutional support is really strong, especially strong in Ethiopia. So that's kind of, especially during COVID, they've been able to, even athletes who aren't able to race abroad have still been supported with a salary from their clubs, which I think has not been the case in Kenya. So they've struggled a little bit more from that point of view.
Yeah.
But Kenya is also interesting. Most of the athletes are based in a couple of different places that are quite rural. So Iten, Kaptagat, places like that. In Ethiopia, once athletes get good enough, they tend to move to Addis Ababa, which is the capital city, which is a really big, bustling, busy place. So it looks quite different in terms of the way that they train because they're living in a city. So they tend to drive or take buses long distances to go to particular parts of the city in order to train. Whereas most of the Kenyan athletes, I feel like they're able to just sort of get up and go out the door and they're already in their training location. So there are a few differences like that.
Yeah. So you mentioned, if I can pronounce it correctly, Abibi Bakila.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really a watershed moment for the country. Now, did this government support started under the regime of Haile Selassie?
Yeah, so it's a funny story. He employed somebody called Onni Niskanen, who was a Swedish sort of army guy who came across to train the imperial bodyguard for Haile Selassie. So he wasn't training them for running, really. He was training them just for physical fitness, calisthenics and things like that. But because he was from the part of the world where the strongest distance runners were coming from at that point, in Scandinavia, where they'd sort of developed fartlek training and things like that.
Yeah.
He was in Ethiopia and he had a look around and thought, well, these guys look like they could be quite good runners. And then he started coaching. He kind of talked to Haile Selassie about it, and they came up with this plan of sending some runners to the Olympics. But I think I don't think Haile Selassie realized it was going to go as well as it did and then once it started, once Bikila did that well, then they started to support athletics a lot more.
So the marathon win in 1960 by Bibi Bikila, that was really a watershed moment for the country, a real moment of pride and a real moment of birth for the running movement and the government support of the movement and so on.
Yeah, and it happened at a really interesting time in the history of the whole continent, really, because lots of African countries became independent in 1960 or around 1960, and Bikila winning barefoot in Rome Italy was the kind of colonial power in Ethiopia. It was never a full colony, but it was a protectorate. So there was this real symbolic value of Bikila going to Rome and winning. So I think Haile Selassie said to him before he went, if you win in Rome, it'll be like winning 100 times or 1,000 times or something like that. It's like had this real like powerful symbolic value from that perspective as well.
And famously, he ran barefoot in that marathon.
He did, yeah, which is hard because and on the really hard cobbled roads as well in Rome, it's not the easiest place to run a race barefoot. I wouldn't have thought. Really amazing run.
Yeah, I think it was a little hard on his feet on that particular course.
Yeah.
And he didn't do that to make a statement so much as he'd been training barefoot, and he just thought he could do better at that time.
Yeah, he'd been training mostly barefoot. He had shoes with him, and I think sort of at the last moment he decided not to wear them, that he'd be more comfortable without them. So it wasn't deliberately to make a statement, but it does make a statement in the sense that, you know, being able to win barefoot without the equipment that that the other runners had was a bit, it kind of harked back to Ethiopia in 1896 when they fought a war against the Italians, where they had no equipment and the Italians had boots and had guns and things like that. So it was like it had this real value, even though it was largely just because he was more comfortable running that way.
Yeah. So that gets into a couple of maybe misconceptions. It has been said in other books, other places, that and this is an idea I've heard a lot, and I think a lot of people have this. The book Born to Run, about barefoot running and running in sandals and so on. But the Ethiopians and the East Africans sometimes all lumped together because we don't know much. But they are such good runners because they grew up barefoot, because they couldn't afford shoes, and they ran back and forth to school and all of that. Mm-hmm. But actually the truth is now that some of them live in cities. I think maybe even Haile Selassie may have lived in a city. But
he lives, his house is like up on the hill near Ntoto.
Yeah. And so actually, instead of these people being so poor that they couldn't afford shoes and they ran barefoot and stuff, which is a nice, you know, that is good for your feet to grow up learning how to use them. But they actually have a lot of government support. They do have, in the camps, they do have shoes, and it's a little bit of a misconception that that's why they're so good.
I think so. I mean, the story in the book is when I talked to Kenenisa Bekele's coach about the idea of people being good because they ran to and from school. He pointed out that the house that Kenenisa grew up in was opposite the school. So if he'd been running there, it was only about 100 meters. So I think you know, what people would say is that there's an element of truth to it, because the vast majority of Ethiopian athletes grew up on the farm doing quite hard physical work.
Yeah.
And so what they said was that made them strong. And when they started training as athletes, that was obviously beneficial.
Right.
But I think the problem that I have with the whole barefoot running and the running to school stereotype is that what it does is it kind of implies that it comes naturally to the Ethiopians, that they're just, you know, naturally that good. It's some kind of genetic advantage, and therefore that kind of overshadows the hard work that they put in. If we just assume that Ethiopians and Kenyans win because they're genetically better, it denies the hard work that actually goes into it.
And that's a big part of their culture and their ideas about success as a runner. And so early on, you have in the book a statement that I like. You ask Haile, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
And he was an assistant coach and sub-agent, and you ask him what it takes for a runner to be successful. And he said, the ones that are successful are the ones that use their mind before they use their legs. And I love that, because we tend, this is the reason I wrote my book, we tend to be a little bit mindless in the West about training. It's all measured, and you know, we wear the GPS watches and all of that. And so in Ethiopia, the places that people run, the environment that they run in, their relationship to the environment and their relationship to one another, that all has a real big bearing on their success, but also on their ideas about success. And I think here in America, we have that old, the old cultural icon, John Wayne, where you do things on your own. And that's really not the way success comes about. Nobody does it all on their own. But also, I'm a Feldenkrais practitioner, and I think that is actually the essence of the method, is that it's an awareness method. How do you learn through experience? How do you learn? It's a learning modality, but you learn through movement, through using your body, and through using your mind in conjunction with your body.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot more of that in Ethiopia. And well, you mentioned also, see, here's another misconception we might have. The Norwegian that came over, Ani,
yeah,
he was bringing the most modern techniques at the time,
yeah.
and all of that. So we know that there's a mixture of a wonderful culture here, and also the adding on to of government support and scientific training methods. But the culture really shines through in your book, and I think we all deal with inner voices, and if we don't want to call it that here, we use scientific language, but we deal with magic. And athletes may be in one way or another superstitious, no matter where they come from. So let's dive into the culture a little bit. Let's start with the attitude towards altitude training in Ethiopia. What's their reverence for altitude training and their altitude attitude about what it does?
So most of the athletes I knew were born at altitude and had never really not been at altitude. So they were born. Most of the athletes come from places like Bakoji, or they come from up in the north of Ethiopia, places like Gondar. So they were born at sort of 3,000 meters above sea level, which means that when they move to Addis Ababa, actually they're moving to somewhere that's slightly lower altitude, even though it's at 2,400 meters above sea level. But there was this real sense that they wouldn't necessarily have been able to articulate the kind of scientific mechanism by which being at altitude helps their running, but they would say the air in Untitled Mountain is special in some way.
Yeah.
And it's a place you can go and you can run very slowly, but the special air will kind of infuse your body in some sense, and then you'll be powerful and you'll be able to run quickly when you come back down. And then they would often, so sometimes when they were in Addis, they would then travel up to Gondar, back to the training camp where they grew up, in order to kind of go altitude training from somewhere that was already higher than where most Europeans or Americans would go to go altitude training in the first place. So they did, yeah, they kind of, I feel like they saw their training very much in terms of a balance of both the correct environments. So going to Intoto some days for the high altitude, but then going to somewhere much lower down and hotter to run fast on other days. So it's about balancing those sort of environmental factors, but also about balancing who they were running with. So like the kind of social groups that they were running with, and balancing the relationships with other people in a way that was going to make them successful. Because as you said before, there's this very much this idea in Ethiopia that success is something that is collectively produced. It's not something that you do on your own. That John Wayne mentality just doesn't really exist at all. It's seen as something that you need other people, you need to enlist other people, you need to kind of use their energy in some way, surround yourself with that. And what's really interesting about what you were saying as well about sort of awareness about your own body, I feel like in Ethiopia, that awareness about your own body also extends to having an awareness about other people's bodies as well, and how your running affects that, and how by running in a group and running close together and shielding each other from the wind and things like that, and sharing responsibilities for pacemaking, actually is a way of kind of tapping into a particular kind of rhythm and awareness about the body that is what they believe makes them successful. So
Yeah, so responsibility for pacemaking, that's interesting too, where on a group run, somebody would have to take the lead and then they might drop to the back and somebody else. So it was actually responsibility, but it was a shared one too. So you didn't just have one person you relied on all the time. Again, it was a matter of unity and group synchronicity. And
and a lot of that is to do with the responsibility to not go too fast as well. So that's where this idea of the best runners being the ones that use their mind before they use their legs is this idea that you have to be able to have a certain degree of control, a kind of embodied control over what you're doing in order to not overtrain. So it was seen as the ones that didn't make it were seen as the ones that just let their legs run away with them and they did too much. And that was seen as not just an individual. I think we see that as an individual problem. We wear self-tracking devices that monitor our heart rate and tell us when to rest and when to not rest. They would see that not as just an issue that was to do with their own body, but it was an issue that was kind of shared amongst people, kind of a collective responsibility to make sure that the group improves together, basically.
Because it's so difficult actually to manage yourself or to manage the group, and the tendency to overdo is so universal. And success really comes, and this is something that more and more and more and more, the more you go on, the more you realize success comes from managing yourself, not from doing as much as you can or working harder. And working up to working harder. And you mentioned in your book some really interesting things that I've never heard of any other athletes doing. Intentionally picking terrain that was so hard to run on that you almost couldn't run on it, and you had to run slowly. And over here where I am in Oregon, we're at a stage right now where some of the dirt roads I was running on, some of the higher ones I can't get to right now, but some of the dirt roads I was running on are so frozen and so ruddy and so cupped and so messed up that you can hardly take a step. And
it's been a bit like that here.
What's that? Is it? Yeah, you can. And so I get kind of frustrated with that, and then I realize, well, that's good. I have to walk a few steps, or I have to walk around something.
It's about deliberately, so they would deliberately sometimes go to really roughly plowed fields where you had to almost kind of jump between the furrows. And it's about, just kind of embracing those different ways of thinking. But often, the forest thing, they would deliberately run in the most thickly forested bits on very steep slopes in order to make sure they could only run easy. And it didn't always feel easy because you're kind of like on a camber, there's tree roots to avoid, there's loads of stones and things. And but somehow the way that they sort of zigzag in and out of the trees and the way that they use the different angles of the ground does make you feel recovered by the end of the run, because you haven't had that kind of monotony that you would have if you ran on the road. You're constantly at a different angle. You're constantly having to readjust. You're kind of thinking about it the whole time. You're using little muscles that you don't normally use. And it did have the effect of making you feel recovered, even though sometimes with me, I was like, this is crazy.
So they're playing with a little edge there where I suppose on that kind of terrain, you could get injured. But on the other hand, you're using your pelvis in a different way and your spine in a different way and your hips in a different way. And so it has that refreshing quality to it. And
embracing that risk, I think, is also something that they would deliberately do, kind of acknowledging that a running career is risky in itself. So sometimes going and doing runs that are a little bit crazy and a little bit risky are to kind of face that head on, I suppose, acknowledge it in a way. But it means that the ones that, if they avoid injury, then they end up being incredibly agile and it does help.
I think you need some of that in a race sometimes.
Yeah,
You have,
exactly.
you have to move around people and, maneuver
Yeah.
a little bit. Uh, so this is really fascinating because I've never before, and your book is very readable. I want people to realize that because it's a great read. But I've never heard of anybody training in these particular ways. Maybe Emil Zatopek had some weird training methods, but really, I've never heard of a group of people intentionally training like this. So it's kind of exciting to read about. You write about people running in the forest, and they'll intentionally run past a tree and hook around it and double back on themselves.
Mm.
Well, is that true? Is that what, did I get that right?
Yeah, so if you look at the forest, it's basically eucalyptus forest, so quite relatively widely spaced eucalyptus trees. But there's not, I think, often we think of trail running, we think there's one trail that goes through the forest and we follow it, right? But in Ethiopia, there's all these crisscrossing paths going backwards and forwards through the trees, and they're paths that have been made by the runners. So there's this sense that if you're going for an easy run, the point of it is to meander around, to kind of zigzag about, turn back on yourself, and sort of, yes, because I think they have a very sort of strong sense that hard training should be really hard and easy training should be really easy.
Yeah.
So they see that kind of learning to run slowly as a skill, as a form of expertise, just as much as running fast is. So I think that's the logic of going backwards and forwards and sort of weaving around. But sometimes we'd go and run 15 kilometers and we wouldn't go more than about maybe 1 or 2 kilometers from where we started, because we were just going backwards and forwards. And it was really very different from how I would approach going for a run.
Yeah.
Normally.
So doing something like that, going out and meandering around, as you put it there, is that almost immediately takes away the goal-oriented part of your running, becomes more process-oriented because you're not going anywhere. And you even mentioned something that I could feel when I just read the book, is that it's hard to do that when you go back home. You might be running through a park, you could run around trees and do different things, but the bondage to the habit, the bondage to the mundane, or to the to the get it over with, it is so strong that you tend to not want to do that when you can.
Yeah.
So they get out of their habit that way a little bit, and just do
I
it.
think they're also like consciously trying to make it interesting and not allow their running to become too mundane either. Because I fall into that thing that you just said, that I'll like just I'll use the same routes all the time when I'm here in the UK. And it's so easy to do that. And I think they had this sense that you have to keep the running creative. You've got to make it into like a bit of an adventure sometimes. You've got to consciously try to fight that kind of tendency to have running start to become boring and mundane. So I think they were really, really good at that. And that would sometimes be picking especially crazy routes through the forest, sometimes like going to deliberately to run where the hyenas were, things like that. But also sometimes getting up in the night at 2 o'clock in the morning, going and running up and down a hill. Things like that would just like just liven things up a bit, make it a bit more interesting.
Now let's go there for a minute. So that's a very interesting thing too. So you indicate in the book, first of all, how difficult was it to go to a culture where you didn't speak the language maybe at all, or certainly not well? What was that adaptation process like? That's like
I mean, it's hard at first when you hardly speak the language. I was lucky that my friend Haile, who I spent a lot of time with, he spoke English as well. So he was able to help me translate and things. And I was so the first few months I was getting Amharic lessons as well in town. And then gradually I was able to communicate better with the athletes who didn't speak English. And eventually I speak a relatively good running specific version of Amharic, I think now.
yeah.
But it was, I mean, when I mentioned the kind of running in the night thing, I think one of I think it was only an anthropologist who could have ended up learning about that process, because they wouldn't have told me about it if I hadn't been there every day and been there for 6 months. and earned the kind of trust and been able to speak the language, I think. So that was kind of like a rite of passage for me when they invited me to go for a run at sort of 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, you indicate in the book that they may have been doing that for a long time, but you didn't even know about it because most people are sleeping at 2 in the morning. Yeah. And so after that, there was something they said to you that they now you're not a foreigner. What did they say? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the point of that, it may seem pointless, but I remember you saying in the book that you said, and now I can line up at a starting line for a race, and I'll be thinking about that experience of getting up at 3 in the morning, and running hills, and I'll be thinking, well, I bet nobody else here has done that.
Yeah, exactly.
But definitely a mental toughness thing, which gets into another thing here, another misconception or another surprise for me, is that you stated that a lot of the athletes that you ran with, most of them didn't sleep more on average than say 7 hours a night. And you do mention, I think it's Galen Rupp, or maybe another good American marathoner, I can't remember.
I think it was Galen Rupp. He's someone I remember reading somewhere that he slept 14 hours a day.
14 hours a day. And Paula Radcliffe was good at taking naps. A lot of people would do that in between 2 workouts, or
no, they do often sleep during the day as well. But I just think, but what I found interesting was that there wasn't any kind of anxiety around it, really. Like, people weren't trying to, people would often just take a nap in a room with some other people while they were listening to the radio and things like that. It was like quite an informal way of getting rest. And then we would, sometimes it wouldn't be a case of getting 8 or 9 hours sleep at night. It would be, you'd get a few hours sleep, then you'd go running at 2 o'clock, and then you'd get a couple more hours sleep. And people just didn't seem too stressed out about it in the way that I think probably the likes of Galen Rupp might.
We're so structured here that we're worried if you don't do exactly, get to bed exactly on the right time.
People wear watches now to tell them how much they've slept. So I think that's just remarkable.
So that was another form of mental toughness. Actually, you get your rest when you get it, because when you go to the Olympics, it's not normal life. There's a lot of disruptions and things like that. Your coach may not be there. And so they did a lot of things where they could adapt to life as it came to them. Do you think so?
Yeah, I think so. And definitely. Just and if things went wrong and there were frustrations around, because sometimes they'd be planning a race but they wouldn't get a visa for it, for example. So like there were lots of frustrations around that kind of access to races, and people had to be able to cope with that. So I think it was just because of the kind of precarious nature of the sport in general, it makes people, you either have to be able to cope with that or you can't really do the sport, I suppose.
So there was we're on mental toughness a little bit here. One thing that's not a misconception, and you've already touched on it here, is that elite athletes do try to not do things that are outside their training. They don't want to run around shopping all day, or climb stairs in an apartment building or things like that. They try to avoid those things. There's almost a competition to avoid those things, would you say?
Yeah, so they refer to that as zur in Amharic, which means laps. So it's the same word that they use for laps of a track. But they would say any kind of doing laps, errands, going to the market, wandering around, going to cafes, was, you try to avoid that as much as possible. Keep that for the track, basically. Yeah.
So now here's a fascinating term in your book. You use the word condition, and it means something entirely different to Ethiopian runners than what we would probably just use it to indicate our physical condition or how much training we've done. But it's a different concept. It's more holistic concept there. Can you comment on the term condition?
Yeah, so it was a word that it was interesting because they would be speaking Amharic and they would use the English word condition when they were talking about, and initially I just thought they meant fitness. in a very simple way, the way that we would think that. But I think that it's a word that, if you translate it back into Amharic, means more like kind of air conditions and things like that as well. So it's more to do with a kind of holistic idea about the environment. So they would often say, where is condition, not how can I get fitter. They would say, they would think about it in terms of where can I go, what kind of distribution of environments can I place myself within in order to get better. So I think that's the main way they would think about it. But they would also use the word to talk about confidence. So if they felt like someone was overly confident going into a race and kind of arrogant, they would say that they were over conditioned. So it was also like a psychological state, as much as it was like a state of fitness. So it had like this whole range of meanings.
So it almost had well, you said psychological state. That's a term we would use, but if they didn't use the term psychological state, it was almost a mystical meaning to them sometimes too. Would you say that?
I think so. In the sense of the idea that you can kind of draw particular power or strength from places. Yeah, I think so. They were basically all of the athletes that I knew were very devout Orthodox Christians as well. So there was very much this sense that God had a role in their success, and that there was this idea that God would have a plan for them, and therefore, if they ran badly at a race one day, they would they'd be able to cope with that relatively easily, because they'd say, obviously it wasn't the plan for it to happen today, but it will happen at some point in the future. But I've been thinking a bit more about that recently, and I think that's actually something that you could probably say of quite a lot of American athletes from the way that they talk about their running. Mm-hmm. That people invoke God all the time in relation to their success and things. So I think kind of religious belief and elite sporting performance is also super interesting.
Yeah. So, well, it has to do with how you relate to life entirely, I think. In other words, how do you relate to failure? Is it a learning experience, or did you just screw it up and you'll never make it? What is life presenting
themselves? That's one thing. They wouldn't place the blame on themselves. They would just think, well, it's the next time.
Yeah,
which I think is quite a healthy attitude to have.
And I think all athletes, no matter what semantic terms you use, have some awareness of the fact that peak condition is rare.
Totally. And I think I write that after, because I ran Frankfurt Marathon with one of the athletes from the group, Sedat, who's gone on to run 2:06 actually. But I remember the two of us just limping around the day after. I think we went to a department store because he wanted to buy a phone or something, and just thinking, there's no guarantee that either of us will ever get to the shape that we were in yesterday again. And just kind of recognizing that as that, the other thing about condition is that they saw it as, if you were really in good condition, you were also kind of vulnerable as well, because you're kind of on a knife edge between being right on the condition that you need and being kind of over conditioned and therefore like very liable to injury and illness and things like that. So it was seen as this very delicate state. And actually, I've never been back in the shape that I was in that day in Frankfurt. So it turned out to be true what I wrote in the book.
So what you raised there is interesting, because I was talking to Shane Benzie not too long ago on his book, The Lost Art of Running, and he mentioned in there something I hadn't really thought about. I've watched videos of Bushmen doing perseverance hunting.
Yeah.
And it can go on all day. It's very, very tough thing to do, because you have to do it in warm weather. Otherwise, the animal is not going to get as tired as you want them to be. And I've seen them tracking, all day. They're tracking and thinking and placing themselves in the position of the animal, moving steadily all day in the heat, but not very fast. Compared to compared to the Olympics, they're not running very fast.
Mm.
So our natural state was more as an endurance athlete, but what we're doing, and I'm sure you know the Tarahumara in northern Mexico,
Mm.
they do some running where it's a little bit competitive and they play games,
Mm.
but not the structured kind of training that we do now. And so what you're actually doing, I mean, and I'm sure with perseverance hunting, you go on the hunt and you get something to eat and then you rest.
Mm.
And you stay in that condition where you can move all day because, you know, uh, you couldn't live if all you ever did was sit. So the body
Yeah.
is meant to move, but what we're actually doing now is finding some limits that until we became somewhat civilized with the Greeks and so on, even before that, but in a very primitive setting, we're actually taking the body in a structured way farther than they would have.
Mm.
So we're being more on a knife edge than, you know, there was no point if you just wanted to eat and going out and running as fast as you could to any kind of a time device at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's
so
kind of
in
what you call him, Daniel Lieberman's argument in his book that exercised, where he says, you know, we never, this idea that we evolved to run, you know, we kind of evolved to do this kind of, as you say, you know, spending a long time maybe tracking an animal, but then once you find the animal, you then sit still for as long as you can before you have to do it again. There's none of this kind of
yeah,
planned intensive training. And even with, like, when you mentioned the ancient Greeks, those kind of original Olympic Games, it was seen as inappropriate to train for them. You know, they didn't want to see somebody who, like a kind of strange, they saw a trained athlete as being a symbol of kind of slightly vulgar overwork, I suppose. So what they wanted to see was examples of people who just happened to be very talented at something. They didn't want to see somebody who had trained themselves into the ground. So it's I think it's quite a new and unusual phenomenon in many ways. But I do find the idea that we evolved in some sense to run quite compelling still. I know
yeah,
that
yeah.
I don't know what the latest science of it is, but it seems to me that there's something chemical going on in our brains when we run that implies that it's something that is good for us. And
Yeah, I think so too. The whole skeletal system, the whole muscular system, the organization of the joints and the fascia and all of that is really those are very natural movements, running and walking for human beings.
yeah, yeah,
So when you got back home, you actually still had a goal to run a marathon in 2:20 or under.
yeah,
And so you could have just gotten a training plan anywhere, but you asked your friends in Ethiopia to write you up a training plan.
yeah,
And they were so gracious to give it to you in great detail, I understand.
yeah.
And you followed it, and it worked well for you, didn't it?
It did. I mean, I mean, when I first got back to the UK, I think I was just a bit, it took me a little bit of time to get re-inspired for running in Edinburgh, having been in Ethiopia and it being so beautiful and having the training group and everything. So as a way of making it interesting again, I asked Haile and the coach in Ethiopia to write me a program. And what was interesting was that they often, the training sessions would start off with a place that they wanted me to go to, or kind of an environment that they wanted me to try and find. And then you get the training session. So it was about trying to recreate what was going on in Ethiopia, in Edinburgh. But I found it wasn't actually that difficult to do. It just involved running on a lot of golf courses. It involved running on Arthur's Seat, the mountain in the center of Edinburgh. And then you could recreate the kind of rough road training that we used to do on some of the sort of coastal paths around Edinburgh. So it was actually possible to replicate most of the training. And but yeah, it was really above and beyond what Getamese should have had to do, because he was coaching 2:03 marathon runners at that point. And yeah, he sat down and wrote out a whole training program by hand for me. So I think just the fact that he'd taken the time to do that also meant that I was going to follow it, you know.
Yeah,
Basically. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So uh, What is your running like right now?
At the moment, so I've been, it depends on the state of the lockdown, but we've had no races here since March. So I keep sort of getting into relatively good shape, and then thinking maybe it's going to open up and we're going to have races again, and then there's another lockdown, and then you kind of get a bit disillusioned with it, and it's hard to motivate yourself without kind of competitive opportunities, I think. So, but I'm actually, today I did a very good, much better training session than I've done for ages, and I think I'm in relatively good shape. So I don't know, we'll see. It's I'm doing a kind of combination. I basically do some of the Ethiopian style sessions some days, and then I do some sessions that are from my coach who's here, which are kind of adaptations of what he used to do in the 80s as a marathon runner. And it's interesting. There's a relatively large amount of overlap between those two things, but I kind of pick and choose from different stuff at the moment to make it, basically just to make it as interesting as possible for myself.
So you're never going to forget your experience in Ethiopia, are you?
No. Well, I'm going to try and go back as frequently as I possibly can.
That would be pretty cool. Now, can you see some of the people that you were with, Halie? Can you see him?
When I go back to Ethiopia, I do. I would have been able to go and see those guys when they come to race in Europe. I'd sometimes go to the races as well, because I can be helpful at races with Amharic and just helping to look after the elite athletes sometimes. So I do that for the group that I was in Ethiopia with. But what I really want is for one of the guys to come and run London at some point. So Jamal Yima, for example, he's the Ethiopian record holder for the half marathon. When he moves up to the marathon, hopefully he'll run London. Haile will come over with him. And if that happens, I want to try and kind of repay some of the hospitality that they gave me by taking them to some football matches and
oh, cool.
Like that. If they can stay for a bit longer, that would be great.
Very
we'll
nice.
See.
Well, yeah, that was a life-changing experience for you, and I find it's one of the reasons these podcasts are so great is because I get to meet all these people and maybe even maintain some of the contacts. So I've appreciated that. We talked a little bit about mental toughness, and there was a few things in your book about what the Ethiopians would do in their training that seemed to contradict their careful approach to training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you think of some of those? I have one in particular in mind.
Yeah. Basically, I think it was this sense of having a balance between being very careful and controlled and making sure you don't overtrain most of the time, but then occasionally just doing stuff that seemed a bit crazy, like the running up and down the hill at 2:00 in the morning, or going to parts of the forest that were especially dangerous. And I
hyenas.
Hyenas, yeah. Exactly. So I think that the idea behind that was often the adjective that people would use to describe someone who was really good at running was dangerous. So they'd describe them as adegenya in Amharic. And I think that meant that they had a certain edge to them, that they were willing to do stuff like that was a bit crazy, and that to be able to embrace that kind of craziness sometimes was part of getting to the top and being a top athlete. So
yeah, I am a very dangerous man.
I'm a very dangerous man. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So in wrapping up, well, one more example that sometimes they would train through illness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was another.
Yeah, so you'd see people with a clove of garlic up each nostril.
Yeah.
Running through the forest. The idea being that it would kind of help to flush out any kind of illness.
Yeah, and my background would say, hey, you need to rest when you're sick. But I know an ultra runner not too long ago that had a sinus infection, and he was going out for a fun 22-mile run. Lots of elevation gains.
Yeah. Some people, just a bit crazy, I guess.
So to sum up, in order to achieve your potential, there's a lot of factors, and probably the most important foundational one for everyone who's listening would be careful management of your life. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what they would, the way that Haile described this was basically the avoidance of hodgepodge things. He used when he was speaking about it in English, he used the phrase hodgepodge, which I really liked, which basically just means cutting out the stuff that doesn't matter, isn't going to help you with what you're trying to achieve. So for an elite athlete in Ethiopia, that means not going to cafes, not just sitting around, not kind of draining your energy by being on Facebook and things like that. So yeah, I think that would be how they would articulate that, I think.
Yeah, avoiding negative distractions of all kinds. That's
Yeah.
fundamental.
And then beyond that, basically, this very strong belief that success is produced collectively and that you need to surround yourself with the right kinds of people.
Yeah, that was interesting in your book. You were often referring to someone looking back and seeing that you're dropping back a little bit. And what do they do? Click and point to their heels?
Yeah, click their fingers.
Up
Yeah,
and down my feet.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so a real strong, almost like an invisible cord connecting you. Where you gotta get back up in that group there.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
And another thing, I'm so often when I'm running, you talk about running trails and just staying on that trail, but there could be something often interesting off to the side, but you won't take the time to go see it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. I think like at the moment, with the other thing with my running is that you're so busy sometimes that it's hard to give yourself the time to go and explore and take things a little bit more slowly. But yeah, it's hugely beneficial if you can find that time.
Yeah. So Ethiopians don't talk too much about natural ability or talent. They talk more about controlling your life, managing your training, and putting in the work carefully. Yeah.
Yes, they describe it as they use the word adaptation when they're talking about training. So there's this sense that it's not, anyone can just adapt to it if they do the right things, I think. And that's kind of at the core of this kind of the philosophy of not really believing in talent. And what was really interesting is that they would use the word properly to describe training, not hard. So they wouldn't say, I would say, I'd ask them what the key was to being a successful runner. And they wouldn't say it's, you'd often hear someone say, oh, you've got to train really hard. They didn't say that. They say you've got to train properly, which means something very different.
Yeah.
I think. And that's what, it's actually very similar to what Charlie Spedding writes in his book about running, that it's not about, it's about doing it properly, not doing it hard, I guess.
Yeah. Even scientifically, we know that's true.
Yeah, exactly.
So scientifically, we do everything scientifically in the West, and look, it's gotten us great benefits. But there is one tragedy of looking at everything scientifically and missing out on the beauty of the actual people that you're working with. Yeah. What's a human being? A little bit more than a machine.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I think the other thing with measuring everything scientifically in the lab, and getting all that VO2 max data and things on yourself is that it kind of, what it does is it gives you a set of limits that you don't feel like you can go beyond. And I think that they would, they don't have access necessarily to that kind of physiological testing and things, but I don't think they would be interested in it even if they did, because it would, most people feel like there's maybe something inside themselves that's just waiting to get out into the world, and that they're going to somehow run this kind of transcendent performance. Why would they want to be told by a sports scientist that, your limit is 210, for example, for a marathon? They wouldn't want to know.
Yeah, you really can't measure in a lab potential.
No.
Yeah. That's a great thing.
Yeah.
You can't measure spirit either. So is there anything else you'd like to say to wrap up before I refer people to your book?
No, just thank you for a really interesting conversation. I really enjoyed that.
I loved it. I really did. So I'm going to put your book on the screen here when we edit this and so on. But cool. Where can people find your book, and where can people find out more about your work? And I assume you're thinking about some new projects.
So I think the book's available. It's on Amazon. It's in, I think, Barnes and Noble, big, hopefully it's in some independent bookshops in Oregon. I don't know. You'll have to have a look around and see, but it's available from the big places. I don't know what the next project's going to be for me yet. I've just got a job in Durham as an assistant professor in anthropology department, so I need to come up with something soon. But I haven't. I've kind of. I feel I'm kind of not ready to let go of the Ethiopian running thing yet, but there will be something in the pipeline.
Oh, so you're not quite ready to let go of the running thing?
Yeah, I might do something. I don't know. It could be another project on running. It could be something completely different. I'm not sure yet.
Yeah. Well, I think anything in the area of deep hanging out is a benefit
exactly.
to the world.
Yeah, it'll definitely involve that. That's for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, Michael, thank you so much. And we'll go ahead and stop the recording here.